Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today for our webinar on impactful influencing, harnessing the power of the MBTI assessment to influence effectively and ethically. My name is Jennifer Overbo. I'm the Director of Product Strategy here at CPP, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Today's webinar will run for approximately 45 minutes. During the presentation, if you have questions, please submit them to me anytime using the questions function in the webinar controls. We'll allow 15 minutes today for Q&A at the end of the webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded, so we will be sending you a link to the recording as well as to the influencing white paper in the next few days. Now I'm very happy to welcome our speakers, Damian Killen and Rich Thompson. Damian is the Managing Director and founder of Thrive, an international human resources consultancy based in Dublin, Ireland. He's a CPP author and a Myers-Briggs type expert and consults with organizations around the globe. Rich Thompson is the Divisional Director of Research here at CPP, and he leads all of our research efforts in the US and worldwide. Rich has extensive experience in developing surveys and assessments for use in both organizational information gathering as well as predictive research. And CPP was fortunate to have Damian and Rich partner on the Type and Influence research project that they'll be discussing today. In fact, today's webinar is based on an adaptation of the keynote session that they both presented at the 2015 MBTI Users Conference. So let's get started learning more about Type and Influence. Welcome, Damian and Rich. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and much appreciated for that introduction. So here's just a quick overview of what's going to happen in the next 45 minutes. We'll look at the genesis of the idea, we'll take you through our research journey, and also show you how we're applying some of what we've learned with organizations currently. And also you'll get a chance to learn about how the MBTI framework will help you influence others successfully and ethically, and hopefully find out how you're being influenced all the time in everyday situations. So hopefully you get a different lens to look at those two things. It was more than Rich and I, so we should introduce you to the entire research team. In the back row is Derek and myself and Sharon, all from Thrive. And in the front row, in the middle is Brendan, also from Thrive. And then Nancy is on the left and Rich is on the right from CPP. So it was a team effort, even though Rich and I are fronting it up. The 7 played their part throughout the process over the last 2 years. So 5 stages in our research journey. We'll try and go through this as quickly as we can. The first one is gathering data and reviewing the literature. The second one was interviewing each of the types. And then we had an online survey followed by more in-depth surveys and interviews, and then a final short survey. So let's look at the first one, the data gathering and the literature review. So these are actually the headings from a Thrive team meeting in October 2013, where we started looking at the whole idea of influencing from a whole lot of different angles, having read as much as we could about what was there. So there was a little bit about the biology of influencing, the ethical and unethical persuasion came up over and over again, stories of influencing, practice of influencing, and then the psychology of influencing. So just as a diversion, but one that you might enjoy, let's do a little bit about the biology of influencing. So in, the literature review, first of all. First of all, the piece about the literature review. Very little has been written about personality type and influencing. Amy Cuddy has done a TED talk that some of you may have seen and also written in HBR and elsewhere about different poses and how you can help yourself be more effective. The ethics are critical to what we think about influencing and whether we believe it's just somebody trying to pull the wool over our eyes or whether it's something that's a meaningful encounter between 2 different parties. And the third point came up over and over again, that underpinning influencing is a degree of rapport. Now this was talked about as trust, as warmth, and a number of other different factors, and this point we'll come back to much later on in this webinar, but it's a key point. And the final point was that influencing is in our DNA. We have it from the very beginning. So I'm just about to show you a series of advertisements, and they involve advertisements for a particular nappy. Okay, and in this one you will see the circles indicate where the eyes of the person looking at the advertisement goes from. So 1 is right in the middle, and it's between 4 and 5 before we're over at the child's face, and then it's number 9 before we read extra gentle for the most sensitive skin. So by changing the position of the child in the next example, you can see that it only takes 7 jumps before the person is reading the content of the advertisement. So we follow people's eyes naturally. Even as babies, we're following eyes all the time, but it's the 7th fixation before we get to read the advertisement. So then it's analyzed for 106 people doing it. So here is the heat map when the baby is facing out. Okay, the longest time is looking at the baby's face, right? And a little bit on the reading of the advertisement. Whereas when we change it for the second image, look where the heat map goes. Still a lot of people focusing on the child's face, but only 10 seconds rather than 21 seconds, and equal time in reading the content of the advertisement. So that's why we respond to human signals. That's why faces guide us to where we should look, be it a fixed image, or if we're talking to somebody or we're watching somebody present, etc. There's a lot more in the research around having a cup of coffee in your hand and the other person having a cup of coffee is more likely for them to feel warm towards you because they're feeling warm in their hand. It links to the brain, but I'll give you that information another day. So let's go to, so what we did next was we interviewed 52 people. I can't remember exactly how many, I think it's 52, of all different types. And as you see in the next slide, we then started to analyze that data, right? And we analyzed to see was or were the responses relating to function pairs, dominant function, or temperaments. We had 5 of us do this so that we all did it independently and came back and shared our responses. And what we found was that the function pairs probably had something to do with it, the dominant function maybe, and the temperaments definitely not. So at this stage, we were confident that if we were to do our first large online survey, that we would have questions about function pairs and dominant function within an overall survey about type and influencing. The third stage is the online survey, and I'll let Rich tell you what we found out there.
Hi everyone, I'm Rich, and I'm going to be talking about the online survey. So from what Damian and the team learned from the interviews, we incorporated into an online survey. We got people from 2 different sources. We had the Thrive database, and from there people who were referred by our global distributors. And we also polled people who had completed the MBTI on our commercial website in the prior 6 months. And for both cases, we sent them an invite to the survey and asked them to forward it on to others who they thought might be interested, just to get as broad of a audience or a group of participants as we could. We asked a number of questions. We asked age and gender and things like that. But the key part for the survey, tapping back into the dominant functions and the function pairs, was we had some questions on general influence and a number of questions on specific influence items. I'll get into those a little bit more. I'm not going to go through all of those, or this entire presentation would be just about the data. We also asked people about their 4-letter type and their confidence in type. So what did this sample look like? We ended up with about 3,700 people completing the survey. As you can see here, it was primarily two-thirds female, one-third male, age 42. We had folks who indicated their country of residence as 85 different countries, so it's a fairly global sample, although still a lot from the US and the UK and Europe. And when we looked at the people who indicated they were confident, sample drops down to about 2,800 people. And as Damian alluded to, we were particularly interested in the function pairs. And so this is just the distribution on the functions. I had, in the white paper, it gives you the whole type information. So when if you have questions about that, you can see that in the white paper. But as you can see here, we had a fairly even distribution of STs, NFs, and NTs, a smaller number of STs, but still at 400 people, plenty to do kinds of statistical analyses we wanted to do. So again, the survey had some I guess I have a whole type. So we looked at the whole types to see where people indicated they needed things or didn't need things. And what we found was that for the ENFPs, you can see they're bolded, they needed 4 of the 5 of these more than any of the other types. And the ISTPs indicated that they needed those things to be present less than any of the types for the most part. So this is a lot of information. We tried to cull it down into something simple. And so for the next question, we said, of those 5 things, please indicate the one that's most important for you. And so looking at a lot of different ways to try to present this information, what I ended up doing, and we agreed was a meaningful way to summarize what's going on, is to look at the differences that occur when you run the chi-square analysis, which we did. And without getting into all the statistics, basically it's showing differences between what you see in the data, the observed, and the expected, which it computes based on that analysis. So numbers here above the bar are saying that we're getting more people than expected, indicating that something is important. Numbers below the bar saying less than what we expected are important. And when you look at the chart, you can see that for STs and SFs, we saw more often than we would have expected that they indicated trust was an important element of influence. Similarly, for NTs, trust was not particularly important for influence. The other 2 things that emerged that are larger bars, if you will, was rapport for NF and understanding for NTs. So what this starts to show us is that there's clearly something going on here at the preference, at the function pair level, and there are differences in what people see as important. So the next question, again, at whole type level, was looking at barriers, and we asked, what are the barriers to effective interaction and influence? And again, we had a different set of alternatives, A, B, C, and D here, which are listed out over here. But what we saw again emerge was that ENFPs also had the most barriers for the most part. They were the highest scores in 3 of the 5. And the ISTPs had the lowest score, were towards the lower end for most of the 5. So at this stage of the analysis, it certainly looks like there's something going on at the function pair level, particularly for the NF and the SP, seeing some differences. And then again, looking at this the same way we looked at it the last time in terms of the chi-square differences between expected and observed, we see again some differences that are emerging for the function pairs. So here for the STs, you can see that being ill-prepared or unclear is a big deal for STs, whereas the absence of listening and the being told what to do is not that big of a deal to them. For the NFs, absence of listening is a huge deal, and either party being ill-prepared or unclear is not that big of a deal. So the point of these analyses is to say we're onto something here. There's something going on at the function pair level. Now let's do a little bit of a deeper dive into that. So for the next 2 questions of the 7 that we asked, which we're going to deal with here, there are 4 responses that were crafted from what we learned at the interview stage that we hoped would appeal to each of those function pairs. So it's not as if the first part of the thing is S and the second part is T. It's the total package of the response option was intended to appeal to an ST or an NF or what have you. Because there's 4 response options, by chance, if there was nothing going on around type, we would expect to see flat, these bars looking like this with 25% of people approximately endorsing each of those responses. So that's how we're kind of testing the hypothesis. Is there something going on with the function pairs? For simplicity on the charts, I'm just going to show it as a line, otherwise we'd have a lot more lines to look at. And you can see how that looks here on this chart. So the first question asked about influencing style and what most closely describes your style of influencing. So for each, like I said, there were 4 response options, and it's very clear here how these were set up. This is the response option. The first bullet was set up to appeal to STs. The expectation that STs would endorse this item, this response, over the other 3. Similarly, connecting with people and being supportive was expected to appeal to NF. Hopefully that makes sense. The way that we've graphed these response options compare with it, and then we graphed it by saying, did people endorse the response option that matched their function pair? And you can see on the chart for this question, all of the function pairs endorse that more than chance in terms of what matches their function pair, and endorse the opposite less than chance. So what that says to us is, yes, there is something going on here. And then we can dive in a little bit interesting about it. What's interesting on this one is that the NF said, more than half of the NF, or twice what we'd expect by chance, said that connecting with people and being supportive describes their influencing style, whereas the opposite describes 5% of their describes influencing style for 5% of them. SS, we see the same thing, and STs. The big drop is on the NTs, where their influencing style is really across most of the response options close to chance, suggesting that maybe NTs do something a little bit differently than the other preference pairs, or sorry, functional pairs. So the next question was about barriers or what's least effective. And what we saw in the data presented earlier and here as well, that sometimes thinking about what doesn't work or what are challenges is actually more enlightening than looking at what does work. Again, it's the same thing, and this one's a little bit harder to wrap your head around, but using the ST example here, so we crafted response options that were intended to get STs to say, oh, it doesn't work for me when people are like idealistic and use emotive arguments with relevance to real life. And as you can see on the chart for the STs, that came in right at about chance. But again, for the NTs, we see that poorly thought out argument with few possibilities is a real problem for those folks. For the SFs, we see that detached and impersonal and complicated rationale doesn't work for them. And for the NFs, we see that they generally endorse that being closed-minded and narrow-focused doesn't work for them. And the pattern here is kind of the takeaway. And I'll go on to do a little bit of a deeper dive on the NFs. So this is taking the bars on this chart for the NFs and pulling them out. And what we see here is that the match, the NF portion, seems to be important or an issue when they're influencing. But the second letter match is also an issue. So something about the F is getting, about 70% of the NFs to endorse those response options. So we did additional analyses. We looked at the dominant functions, and it pulled up as well. And the takeaway from the large online survey was that it's clear there are some key differences going on in the functions, that people influence and are more influenced when there's consistency between how they prefer to take in information and make decisions and how people try to influence them. So if I'm an ST, having an ST argument works better for me than having an NF argument. The other two sort of oddities that we saw, or not oddities, but insights, were the NF function pairs seem to use NF consistently, and they seem to have a larger emphasis, if you think back to the data we saw, on that feeling function. And STs are least likely to require a match to their preferences. People can try to influence them in a lot of different ways unless you use NF language, and then it really doesn't seem to work. So those were some of the conclusions we drew from the survey, and we took that information and went back to the team, and Damian did some additional data collection, which I will hand over to him now.
Thank you, Rich. That's just a sample of some of the information. We've oodles and oodles of information that we got from that huge data sample. So once we got that, and we had ruled out that it wasn't the dominant function because we got no consistency around dominant function in the answers to those questions, and that it was clear that it was about the function pairs, we then wanted to get more qualitative information. So the fourth point on our journey was these in-depth surveys and interviews. So if we go to the next slide, so this time we invited people who had selected from the first survey that they'd like to hear from us again, and we offered them a chance to do another online survey, of which we had two different ones so that we weren't getting all the same information. The second option was in-depth interviews, and I want to just give you some sample questions and words and things that we picked out that appear to be, meaningless at one level but very profound at another level. So the first thing we can definitely say, it is got to do with the two middle letters. It's got to do with the sensing, intuition, thinking, and feeling preferences. That's what influencing is about. Statistically significant, no doubt about it, 3 stars, all of the stuff that you need to know. And that was confirmed over and over again with in-depth analysis. And I'll give you examples when I give you examples of each of those influencing identities. In this one, this is a word cloud of all the SF responses in the second round. Okay, collaboration is nearly as large as every other word that was used in the top 50 words for SFs. For all of them, it had to be a two-way street. Other word clouds for each of the individual types and for each of the function pairs give us similar information, but not with such huge emphasis as the SF give us. The next slide that you've just had a glimpse of is, this is interesting. When people were asked to describe what they wanted from the other person that was trying to influence them, a word that kept coming up again and again was genuine versus authentic. Okay, genuine or authentic. When we started analyzing the data, SFs only ever used the word genuine and NFs only used the word authentic. So you wouldn't expect that to have a relevance to personality type, but it does. Now, more Ns will use authentic. 1 or 2 the STs use the word authentic, but very few, and 1 or 2 NTs use the word genuine. But it's an SN split. They're both sound feeling words, but if I'm to give you where my type hat, authentic is a more complex word and the N's are attracted to it, in my opinion. Genuine, it is what it is, so it appeals to the sensing. So little things like that were gems of wisdom that we've picked up, and we've more, obviously. The last bit on this research journey is a short survey we conducted for everyone that attended the MBTI Users Conference in San Francisco last September. So as they registered, they were given an iPad with a few questions, 4 or 5 questions, and we didn't offer them 4 choices. This time they were only offered 2 choices. So let's look at the next slide that shows. So one of the questions was, when influencing someone you know, which of the following most closely describes your style? So if you were an ST, if you had selected your type in the first question, then the survey generated only 2 options. So an ST would be offered being straightforward and direct with an objective rationale as to why something needs to be done and convincing others of this. And they were also offered enthusiastically motivating people to think or act in a different way and offering exciting alternatives. So they were offered the NF option. And the same for each of the different function pairs. The diagram on the right shows that 90% of the time people will choose the ST option when they're offered the ST or NF. 86 for SFs, 85 for NFs, and just over 70 for the 71% for the NFs. Now we know that for the NTs it's a little bit less, and it's 71%, because the opposite, SF, is a socially desirable response. So we always expect NT options to be less. That's not unusual, right? But what's clear, and I think the message I want you to take away, is that if you're speaking the opposite language to the language of the person you're trying to influence, your chance of being successful can be as little as 10%, right? And if you can imagine that the person may not want to be influenced in the first place, then you might as well give up. Okay, so MBTI helps us shape and have words in order to influence effectively. Okay, so what do we know about influencing? Well, one of the underlying points is that trust and warmth equal rapport. I made this point early on, and if you can think of it like making a cake or a pie, that the ingredients of the casing or the base of the pie are pretty similar, okay? There's going to be flour, maybe there's going to be sugar, there's going to be butter or margarine, and you need that for the pie. So that's what trust and warmth are. They're like that. But then the flavor and the taste of the pie depends on the personality type, okay? And we've all grown up with pies that we like or don't like, and it goes back to our youth and what we were given and what flavor attracted us. But what's really critical is that you need the rapport at some level before the MBTI and speaking the right influencing language can have an impact. Now, if you're not face-to-face with a person, if you're dealing with them remotely, or if it's through a written media, well then MBTI language is even more important, where there is little or no rapport initially, but you should be using that to build up rapport. So we'll go on to the next one, and that's to tell us that trust and warmth equal rapport. So for those of you that have English as a first language, I hope this works for you. For those of you who English is not your first language, it's unlikely to work. So you can play along, but I just warn those that English isn't their first language that it may not work. So I want you to think of a number between 1 and 10. So you've got a number between 1 and 10. I want you to multiply that number by 9. Now you wish you had chosen a different number. Okay, but anyway, you've chosen a number between 1 and 10, and you've multiplied by 9. With your answer, if it is a 2-digit answer, add your 2 numbers together to come up with one new number. So you've thought of a number, you've multiplied it by 9. That number now we're going to convert into a new number by adding the 2 digits together. The next step is subtract 5 from that number. So subtract 5 from your new number. And when you've done that, we're going to convert the number you're left with to a letter. So if your number is 1, the letter is A. If the number is 2, it's B. If it's 3, it's C, etc. So hopefully you've got a letter at this stage and you haven't lost track. So you've got a letter. and I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. I want you to think of a country beginning with that letter. I want you to go to the last letter of the country and pick an animal beginning with that letter. And I want you to go to the last letter of the animal and pick a fruit beginning with that letter. A bit complicated, but hopefully you're playing along. How many of you were thinking of a kangaroo in Denmark eating an orange? Hopefully some of you were. The statistics say that those English speaking, it should be at least 90% of you, and some of you might have been thinking of a koala in Denmark eating an apple. Now, I would love to say that I'm a magician and this really works fantastically, but basically I'm giving you this example as an illustration as to what happens in influencing in everyday life. Successful influencers are narrowing our choices so that we feel that within this parameter we will choose that. It happens when you go to the supermarket. It happens when you do online shopping. All of this is what's happening. So in order to be able to influence ethically and successfully, you need to know some of this data. Now, we don't have time to go into it in detail today, but I'll give you a very simple example of a study, which I'll find the reference for if you need it, where they were selling bicycles online. And there were 4 different types of bicycles. One had more gears than the other one. The second one had better lights. The third one was more crash resistant, etc., etc. All had different qualities. And what they did was they kept rotating the order in which the 4 bicycles were being shown on screen, right? And each day they monitored the sales. And what they found was that whatever bicycle was the first option always outsold the other 3 bicycles on that particular day in total. So one bicycle would get more than 50% of the sales, and that was the first one, and the other 3 would make up to a maximum of 49%, right? So what's obvious from this is that being first on the list is important, but that what we're doing is we reference all the other options to whatever the first option is. So even though I might have been gone in for a particular type of bicycle, I start thinking, oh, it doesn't have what the first one have, or it does have this. Everything is referred to it. So if you're trying to convince someone of a proposal at work, I used to go with, okay, I'll come up with something that's way too expensive as my first option, 2, which sounds fairly sensible and the one to go for, and the 3 looks a bit ridiculous. So I'd always place it in the middle. And then I read this, and I've changed my entire style that I always put the important one first. And you know what? It works every time, okay? Because that's what people are referring to. They're missing out if they don't go with this one, is the feeling. So we go on to the next slide. So what we've done is, and I'm afraid we're not just showing all of these because they're coming up in the product later in the year, we have developed identity cards based on the 4 different identities. So let me just take you through some of the data and what we found. So STs, let's do the right thing. It's really important for the STs to do the right thing. They tend to be very straightforward, direct, and an efficient influencer. They like to gather the facts to support a very robust rationale, right? How they form an emotional connection typically is through past experiences, okay? And they will listen to people who are clear and objective, but what they won't do is just find and build rapport just for the sake of it, okay? There are do's and don'ts, as there are with each of them. For the STs, the do is outline the pros and cons. You must do that. You need to provide the facts and the evidence to support your point of view. And what came through over and over again in the interviews was be clear, be direct, be honest and credible. Don't get too emotional. That's a turn-off. Or if you become overly personal, they feel, you know, you're trying to hoodwink them, right? Don't be inconsistent or flawed. And one key thing was don't hesitate. People who influenced them that hesitated were gone. They were written off from the very beginning and had not got a chance when it came to it, okay? They knew they had to improve on that and be more tolerant, but they're not, okay? That's when there's a lot of information coming at them. If somebody's hesitant, it suggests weakness, and maybe they don't know, even though they should know what they're talking about, maybe they don't know, and therefore not able to engage with them. So, some direct quotes from them. I make sure all the ducks are in a row, but I'm ready to adapt. I usually use logic and common sense, letting the facts, numbers, or reason do the persuading. If I can help someone imagine they are using the idea or product, etc., then I'm likely to influence them as well. I need to be clear. You need to be clear. I want to be concise, so please be concise with me, and don't gush and don't treat me like an idiot. So that's just some of the flavor of what we got from STs. I think what's really important to remember is straightforward, direct, and efficient. Also, they scored themselves very highly as effective influencers. Not everybody else scored them as highly as they did, but they rated themselves higher than any of the other four, or any of the other three. So let's tell you about the SFs, okay? So if the ST is about realism and being realists, SF is about collaboration. I showed you that in the word cloud earlier, and so let's work together seems to be their motto. They're the ones that actually are a bit concerned that influencing mightn't be a good thing, okay? That am I being ethical in doing this? So they're asking themselves a lot of questions even before they engage in the influencing interaction. But they tend to be practical, they're positive, they're collaborative, and they empathize with the other person. So for them, the bond is what it's all about. The relationship is key to the influencing process, okay? You need to be able to listen and show you've understood. You also should use personal examples, right? So the do is lead by example. Trust and honesty are at the heart of it, and show me you've listened. So if you want to influence an SF, learn how to grunt. Yes, oh, I see, yeah, right. So, and then repeat what you've heard so they hear it back and they say, yes, that person was really listening, right? Don't try to be deceptive. So if you're going to grunt, do it enthusiastically and do it with meaning. Don't exclude the important facts or the feelings, and don't use big words, okay? Don't try to baffle them with technical information. It doesn't work, okay? You're only looking important, and they dislike people who want to look important for the sake of it. That's a warning to the NTs. Okay, let's go on to the third. Oh, sorry, some direct quotes from the SFs. Generally, it seems to have a negative connotation. However, I feel it can be done in a very positive way if it's done honestly. An emotional connection is very important. There must be mutual respect for the other person, their thoughts, their ideas, and their opinions. I summarized what they said as safe: simplicity, accurate, factual, and evidence-based. Okay, and most importantly, use personal examples. It wins every time. Okay, that's why the advertisements for the hair products, if they've got a celebrity, that's more important than the technical properties they're trying to tell you about what it does to loose ends and all the rest of it. So, NFs. NFs are about, here's another way. Okay, so what they're going to come across as is encouraging, inspiring, enthusiastic, right? And they are very impactful in the way they influence others because they form an emotional connection not only with the person but with the idea or the concept they're trying to influence, and if they believe in it, the rest of us will believe in it much more readily, okay? They do sometimes forget the detail, and they do sometimes overwhelm people with their enthusiasm for the big idea. So if you want to influence them, do show passion, do show authenticity, engage their values and challenge their imagination. And very, very importantly, tell them why. If they don't have the why, it's very difficult for them to engage. It doesn't make sense without the why, right? Don't bore them with too much detail. don't lack energy yourself or belief in what you're trying to present. Interestingly, some quotes for them: it makes me feel connected, nervous, impassioned, invested, excited. Someone once described me as relentlessly reasonable. I'm an inspirational motivator. Building trust and demonstrating empathy is key to what I'm trying to do. Sometimes I'm quiet and in the background, thoughtful, and sometimes I can be a bit sneaky, which I didn't expect to come from an NF, but that's a direct quote. And the final one are the NTs. So we've had realism, we've had collaboration, we've had enthusiasm, now we've got strategy. Okay, so here's the way forward is the catch call for the NTs. So they're confident, reasoned, and convincing influencers, right? They like to present an informed and an intellectual argument, and they love making choices, the right choices, right? And they do that by challenging us, our mindsets, or what we thought was the status quo. And they do seek an emotional connection, but it's only one of the factors they use. If you want to influence them, be competent, be credible, be compelling. At all costs, be compelling. Acknowledge their expertise. Look, they think they know best, so let them continue to believe that, but also accept their questions or doubts as helping you together find the way forward. Again, don't be overly emotional, and don't make claims that you can't back up. Okay? If they spot the flaw that's there, it undermines everything as far as they're concerned. Some direct quotes. Here's what I recommend. Here's why I recommend it. Here are a few examples. Here are some references. Okay? Let me know what questions you have. So that's the way their mind thinks and the way they come across. When someone was unsuccessful, they didn't provide a convincing vision of the future or how what they wanted fitted into this or into the bigger picture. They refused to listen to me and my doubts, pretending we'd be lifelong friends when we weren't really. Folks, that's just a flavor of some of the stuff that we found. It's not the only thing that we found it, obviously, but if we go on to our next slide, we should have a chance for Jennifer to say a few words before we take the Q&A.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Damian and Rich, for an excellent presentation. And we've received a lot of questions. So we will move on to Q&A in just a moment. But before we do, I want to make the audience aware of a few more resources and events on the topics of type and influence. Just a quick reminder that you will receive a follow-up email within a few days. It will have a link to the white paper. It will also have a link to the webinar recording. We are not sending out slides of the presentation, but we will send a link to the recording. So you're welcome to go back and review everything that was discussed. I know many of you wanted to hear Damian repeat instructions on that activity, and you're welcome to review the recording and sort of practice it on your own there. I also want to let you know that we are working with Damian on a new workshop facilitation product on type and influence. So a lot of what was discussed here will be the basis for a product that will be available for purchase in September, late September, early October, right around the time of our 2016 user conference. And that kit will include everything you need to conduct an impactful workshop on type and influence using the insights from this research. It will also include the identity cards. Those are still in development, which is why we are not sending them out as part of the slide deck. But I know many of you asked about that. So those will be part of the product when it's available. And you can also learn more about how to apply influence and type and get some tips and suggestions from Damian himself at the 2016 MBTI Users Conference, which will be held in San Francisco in September. And if you'd like more information on that, you can go to cpp.com/MBTI conference. So I would like to move on to Q&A. We have a lot of questions, and so Damian and Rich, the #1 question we've received, and it's been worded in various ways, but essentially I think the audience is really interested in understanding, given what you know, if you're in a situation where you have to influence a group in a group setting, and so there's going to be many different mixes of styles present. Do you have any suggestions, and maybe Damian, starting with you, for how to best influence in that group situation?
The answer is yes. It's two things come to mind. One, normally if it is a group setting within a work context, there is a predominant culture and or a predominant type within the audience, and so it's good to be aware of that, even if you have to consider what that might be rather than actually know what that might be. But the rule of thumb that I use in all keynote addresses is NSTF. Start with a big picture and why, then give the details of what you're going to cover, step 1, step 2, step 3. Give a little bit about the logic and the reasoning behind it, and finish with the impact on people. And you need to say that in the first 2 sentences, basically, so that you've engaged the breadth of the audience. But I would nearly always try and find out about the audience in advance and see whether I have an emphasis on a particular preference pair.
Great, thank you, Damian. Another question. Damian, you have a slide, and it's the pie slide, quote unquote, where you have sort of a formula written out. And the formula was trust plus warmth equals rapport. And I've received a few questions about, does that equation sort of hold true for those who prefer NT?
Okay, so as you said there, Jennifer, so the 5 of us in Thrive have been working on this for a while, Anne, Brendan, Derek, Sharon, and myself. And as Jennifer said, we've all together, the 5 of us have written the product that will be released later in the year. But when we went off individually and did our research at the beginning, this kept coming up throughout the literature in different ways, that there seems to be something underpinning any relationship or any influencing interaction. You saw from Rich's analysis of the trust question that trust was chosen less by the N's than it was by the S's. But what we found out when we delved a little bit deeper, that trust means different things to each of the function pairs that we're talking about. So it is relevant for the NTs, but the NTs are probably cute. Would that be I'm trying to phrase this correctly without being irreverent, being an NT myself, but we're clever. Sorry, cute probably is wrong. Clever, that if we know that it's important to build a relationship, then we'll build a relationship. If we know it's important to have a logical argument, then we might do that. So they were also the ones more likely to flex their styles than the other 3 pairs. Just a little bit, not hugely. Now it wasn't like a massive percentage jump, but it was noticeable. So it is important for NTs, even if they're relating to another NT where you think it wouldn't be. But the trust is built up by saying, well, I'm good at this. Oh, you're good at that. I'm good at this, and it's around expertise that the trust is built up, rather than what we typically expect the trust to mean.
Okay, great. Thanks, Damian. Rich, you had a slide that I think either, if you want to step in, or Damian, where we were defining effective influence. And so, Damian, I know you touched on this as well, but a few audience members just want sort of a recap of your definition of what it means to have effective influence.
I'm not tracking. Is it from one of the data slides?
It is from one of the data slides, and I think really what folks are looking for is how do you know that someone's being effective? How do you define that term, effective influence? Okay, so
on the survey, we basically just had the questions as they appeared. So it's whatever that person, the reference that person had in their head about what is effective influence. So we didn't have a specific definition on the survey. We kind of allowed them to have what they think of as themselves being effective in their own head.
Yeah, and I just add to that, Rich, you did a good job there in analyzing that data. And we had put those in as warm-up questions, not expecting to get data that was significant from it. It was more trying to get people into the frame of mind to answer questions further on in the survey about influencing. But actually, effective influencing means different things for the different types, as we saw. But to know whether you're being effective or not would be whether or not you have encouraged, convinced, whatever word you want to use, to change behavior, do a particular thing, buy a particular product, whatever it might be. Now, we are engaged in ongoing research with other companies who are already applying this information. So in one IT company, we're looking at a cultural change, and we're measuring whether or not the audience within that organization that we're trying to drive the cultural change with are being effective, and they're being assessed not only by themselves, others, and particularly by their managers. And we've assessed them before any intervention, and we will assess them again in May, post-intervention plus post first set of results to see whether they've been effective.
Great, thank you. And I'm not sure if well, I'm assuming that you know the answer to this, but I'm not sure that you've thought about this as recently as today. But we have had questions around what was the distribution of the functional pairs among the research team?
Among the research?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, we had all of the function pairs covered.
Okay.
We had reading across. We had 2, 1, 2, 2. So 2 STs, 1 SF, 2 NFs, 2 NTs.
Okay, great. We had a very curious audience to know more about the group. We also have had some questions, which I think are very interesting, around suggestions you might have when working with an individual whose particular use case for influence, quote unquote, is to help manage up. So regardless, I mean, assuming that you know the type preferences involved, assuming this person would know the type preferences involved, are there any caveats to influencing up? Meaning, is there another additional set of considerations when you're managing up versus maybe selling or working among peers? I don't know if anything comes to mind for either of you on that.
The only thing that comes to mind is no. The influencing agenda is pretty similar. There is obviously an issue in terms of managing up. The person above you could fire you or could make your life a bit more difficult, but the same principles apply in the interaction once you begin it.
Okay, great. And we've had a few questions as well. Rich, maybe this one's for you. Were there any significant differences between gender or age on the functional pairs?
Honestly, we didn't look at that. The gender and the age was really more about, do we have a good sample? We didn't do analyses.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying that. We also have some questions around, I'm hoping I'm going to do this justice, I'm paraphrasing here. But Damian, you had talked a little bit about you had provided a short a short description of each function, intuition, sensing, thinking, and feeling, in order when you are presenting to groups. Can you repeat your short descriptions of the 4 functions?
So the sequence in which to give it is intuition, sensing, thinking, and feeling. If you start with the sensing, the intuition will lose interest, so you have to start with the intuition, and you should always finish with feeling because it's more positive, because of the impact on people. So intuition is, what's the big picture? What's the overall direction in which we're going? Sensing is, here are the steps that we're going to take to get there. In other words, the points that we're going to cover, the bullet points, whatever it might be. Thinking is the logic and the reasoning behind it, and feeling is the impact on people of doing this and why we're doing it.
Great, thank you. And I think we have actually received a few questions on this as well, and I think it's an excellent question. And that is, from your perspective, where does ethics enter into the influencing equation? From your point of view.
So I think it's central to it. If you try and do it unethically, you only really can do it unethically once or twice, and then the other person is wise to the fact that you're being abusive or unethical in your approach. And we were very clear from the beginning, the goal of our work was to inform people not only how to influence better, but to understand how others are influencing us. Okay, so in our workshops we use everyday examples from supermarkets. We did the one about the kangaroo in Denmark, etc. We use examples from buying and selling cars. We use it from watching television programs and how that happens, etc., reading newspapers, whatever it might be. So it happens all the time, and being aware of it happening all the time is the first step, and then two, looking for patterns in how it's being done and whether it's being done in an ethical way or trying to, con sounds like a strong word, but that you're not fully informed is unethical. So our goal is to make people as informed as possible in order to do it as ethically as possible.
Okay, thank you, Damian.
And sorry, that came out at the very beginning of our research, and it was the SF on our team that alerted us to that at the very first meeting when some of the ends were off exploring what this would look like as a product 2 years down the road. The SF is saying, are we doing the right thing here? And we checked that out, and other SFs reiterated that as well.
Great. Thank you. We do have one last question, and then I think we're out of time. So maybe a quick answer. Damian, from your perspective working with organizations on this topic, what's the most common sort of pain point, if you will, organizations are trying to address where type and influence really comes into play? And in other words, when they're working with you and expressing an interest in type and influence, what problems are they trying to solve most often?
Whoa. Let me just give you the examples we've had in the last few months. We've had one in relation to engagement and whether we could change the engagement scores for staff and influence them to believe that they're and demonstrate to them that they're having a better engaged experience as an employee. The second one came in the cultural change project I spoke about. A third one relates to messaging to customers with the utilities company and how we can make that more effective to retain customers. And a fourth one relates to a change initiative and trying to include as many people as possible within that change initiative.
Great. Well, it looks like we are running out of time. So I first want to thank Damian and Rich for an excellent presentation. We have received many more questions than we were able to answer, so I want to let the audience know if your question was not answered, we will answer it offline. So we'll run a report of all the questions and make sure that we get back to you with answers. So thank you for your excellent presentation and to the audience for their excellent questions. A quick reminder, the product that we're talking about will release in most likely end of September, early October. That's the time frame. And those identity cards will be a part of that offering. So please stay tuned. We will keep you updated. And to make sure that you are receiving emails on this topic and others, please go to cpp.com/email-press, P-R-E-S-S, as in preferences, to ensure that you are subscribed to our email. And with